The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall trees, casting long shadows across the basketball court of Emsley A. Laney High School in Wilmington, North Carolina. Michael Jordan stood silently at the edge of the gym, his gaze fixed on the court where, decades ago, a gangly teenager had stood with dreams too big for the small town that couldn't quite see his potential. He had left this place as a high school dropout, only to return years later as the greatest basketball player the world had ever known. But today, Michael wasn't here to relive those glory days. He was here for something far more unexpected, something that would shake him to his core. As he stepped into the gym, the faint echo of bouncing basketballs from long ago seemed to whisper in his ears. Memories flooded his mind. The sting of rejection when he was cut from the varsity team, the hours of lonely practice, the hope and hunger that had kept him going when everyone else had already gone home. But as he walked through those familiar halls, past the trophies and the accolades that now bore his name, he couldn't have known that his visit to this gym would lead him to something far more profound. There, in the far corner of the gym, was an elderly man, pushing a mop, working with the same care and dedication Michael had witnessed in his younger days. This was no ordinary janitor. This was the man who had believed in him when no one else did. The man who had quietly encouraged him in the dark corners of that gym when Michael thought he had nothing left. And now, here he was, still cleaning the same floors 47 years later. What happened next? How did a simple visit to a high school gym turn into a life-changing moment for both Michael Jordan and the man who had shaped his destiny? Stay tuned, because the next chapter of this unexpected reunion will leave you speechless. The unexpected encounter. Michael Jordan stood still for a moment, the gym door creaking softly as he pushed it open. The once familiar smell of polished floors and the faint hum of basketballs bouncing against the wooden court floor seemed to transport him back in time. It was as if the echoes of his teenage self, full of determination and youthful ambition, still lingered in the air. He had dreamed of this moment for years, coming back to the place where it all began, the gym, the hardwood, the spot where, as a sophomore, he had been told he wasn't good enough for varsity. But that was a lifetime ago. As Michael walked further into the gym, his eyes scanned the walls, now adorned with his championship banners, photos of him soaring through the air in his Chicago Bulls uniform, and the famous mural that now dominated the far wall. The words "Believe in your dreams" were painted boldly underneath the image, a motto that had become his mantra over the years. He smiled quietly, knowing that what seemed like impossible dreams when he was a teenager had now become his legacy. But something wasn't right. His mind was still racing through the memories, but there was something in the air, a stillness that seemed different from his past visits to the gym. It was then that he noticed him, a figure at the far end of the court, pushing a mop across the floor with slow, deliberate movements. The janitor, with his back slightly bent and his white hair as pure as the gym's clean floors, seemed almost out of place. The old man moved with purpose, taking pride in the simplicity of his work. Michael paused for a moment, his heart doing an unexpected flip. There was something hauntingly familiar about the way the man moved, the concentration in his every action. His mind immediately went to the countless hours he spent in this very gym, often alone, shooting free throws long after the final buzzer had sounded. That was when Mr. Wilson had appeared. Quiet, unassuming, yet ever present, he had been the janitor who had unlocked the gym doors early so Michael could practice before school, the man who had stayed late without complaint when Michael asked for just 5 more minutes of shooting time. In the haze of those memories, Michael could almost hear Mr. Wilson's gentle, encouraging words, words that had always made him feel seen, like someone believed in him even when he was rejected by his peers. But how could this be? How was Mr. Wilson still here? The man who had offered quiet support all those years ago, now nearing 80, still faithfully working the very same job? Michael's heart sank, a sense of disbelief settling in. It was one thing to remember a mentor from your past, but it was another to find them still doing the same hard work, still in the shadows, while the world had changed around them. As Michael approached him, he couldn't help but wonder how this man had endured all these years, never seeking the spotlight, just doing what he had always done, helping kids like Michael day in and day out. He stood there for a few seconds, watching Mr. Wilson mop the floors, his hands steady but slow. It was clear that this man had given so much of himself to others, and yet it felt as if he had been forgotten by the world. "Excuse me," Michael called softly, his voice breaking through the silence. The janitor paused, squinting his eyes at the figure standing before him. "The gym's closed for volleyball practice, son," he said gruffly, "unless you're here for one of the girls." Michael smiled, the familiarity of the moment almost too much to bear. "No, I'm just visiting. I used to go to school here." The janitor nodded. "Lot of folks come back to visit," he said, his voice carrying a hint of weariness. "Must have graduated some time ago." "Class of '81, Michael replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man's eyes widened, as if the pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. '81, huh? That's going back some years." He paused for a second and then added, "I was already working here then." Suddenly, everything stopped. Michael felt his heart beat faster. There it was. The recognition. It was Mr. Wilson, the very same man who had believed in him when he was nothing but a boy with big dreams. The realization hit Michael like a wave. "Mr. Wilson?" Michael asked, his voice full of disbelief. The old man tilted his head slightly, studying Michael's face with a slow, thoughtful gaze. "Do I know you, son?" he asked. Michael's smile broke through. "It's me, Mike. Mike Jordan." A flicker of recognition washed over Mr. Wilson's face, and then his eyes grew wide with shock. "Little Mike Jordan? Is that really you?" he stammered, disbelief and joy mixed in his voice. Michael's heart swelled with emotion. He reached out, pulling Mr. Wilson into a hug before the old man could say another word. In that moment, it didn't matter that the janitor was now frail, his body no longer as strong as it once was. What mattered was that this man had been there for him when no one else had. He had been there when Michael felt alone, when he was just a skinny teenager, rejected by the varsity team, and wondering if he'd ever make it. When they pulled apart, Mr. Wilson's eyes were filled with tears. "I can't believe you're here, son. All these years I never expected to see you again." Michael looked at him with a soft smile. "I'll never forget what you did for me, Mr. Wilson. You gave me the chance when no one else would." But as he looked at the man who had quietly shaped his journey, Michael couldn't ignore the shock that still lingered in his chest. Mr. Wilson was still here, still working, still cleaning the gym. At 80 years old, the man who had helped ignite the fire in him was still doing the same work, quietly making a difference in ways no one else saw. It was at that moment that Michael Jordan made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. The dinner invitation. As the initial shock of the reunion began to settle, Michael found himself reflecting on the years that had passed. He had become Michael Jordan, the man who had defied the odds, the global icon, the winner of countless championships. Yet standing in front of Mr. Wilson, he realized something profound. None of that success would have been possible without the quiet belief of this humble man who had stood by him during some of the toughest moments of his youth. Mr. Wilson had never asked for recognition or praise. He had simply believed in Michael when no one else did. The weight of this realization hung heavily on Michael's heart. Here was Mr. Wilson, still working tirelessly at 80 years old, still serving the same school, still mopping the very floors where Michael had once poured his sweat and tears. There was something heart-wrenching about seeing this quiet, devoted man, who had played such a pivotal role in Michael's life, still laboring away with no fanfare or recognition. It didn't sit right with Michael. "Do you think we could catch up after you're done?" Michael asked, his voice sincere. "Maybe grab some dinner?" Mr. Wilson looked up at Michael, clearly surprised by the invitation. He stood still for a moment, as if trying to understand why someone like Michael Jordan would want to spend time with him, the old janitor who had spent his life cleaning floors and quietly supporting students without ever asking for anything in return. After all, Michael had made a name for himself on the court, surrounded by celebrities and athletes, constantly surrounded by high-profile people. Why would he want to share a meal with someone like Mr. Wilson, who had no claim to fame and no rich history other than his unassuming role in the background? "You want to have dinner with me?" Mr. Wilson asked, his voice tentative. "Don't you have important people to see, someone more important than an old janitor like me?" Michael smiled warmly, his eyes filled with gratitude and affection. "Right now, Mr. Wilson, you're the most important person I want to see." Mr. Wilson paused. The sincerity in Michael's voice made him smile, his eyes twinkling. It was a smile full of warmth, full of pride. "Well, in that case," he said, adjusting his pants, "I guess I'll take you up on it, but nothing fancy. These old bones don't fit too well in fancy chairs anymore." Michael chuckled at the thought, already thinking of the perfect spot. "I know just the place." The simplicity of that moment, the invitation to dinner, meant more to Michael than any championship trophy or endorsement deal ever could. He realized that, as much as he had achieved, there were still moments that were far more valuable than any accolade. Sharing this meal with Mr. Wilson wasn't just about reconnecting with his past. It was about honoring a man who had given so much to him without ever expecting anything in return. Michael felt a deep responsibility in that moment. And so, with Mr. Wilson agreeing to dinner, the two of them left the gym together, stepping out into the quiet Wilmington evening. Michael knew, deep down, that this dinner wouldn't just be a catch-up. It would be a chance for him to reflect on the quiet sacrifices made by those who helped him along the way. People like Mr. Wilson, who often go unnoticed, yet whose impact lasts forever. An evening to remember. As Michael and Mr. Wilson drove through the familiar streets of Wilmington, the city had changed in ways that were both noticeable and subtle. New buildings had sprung up where empty lots once stood, and familiar landmarks had been replaced by shiny modern structures. Yet, despite the rapid transformations in the world around them, Michael couldn't help but feel that some things had remained the same. Like the quiet dedication that Mr. Wilson had poured into his work for decades. A dedication that, unlike the city around them, had never wavered. They arrived at Katie's Diner, a place that had stood the test of time. The bright neon sign flickered in the night, and the familiar red vinyl booths beckoned them inside. The diner was as Michael remembered, sturdy, timeless, and filled with the warm aroma of freshly cooked food. It was a place where ordinary people, like Mr. Wilson, could come to unwind after a long day, where memories of simpler times lingered in every corner. This was not just any restaurant. It was a sanctuary of shared history, a place where lives intertwined in small, quiet ways. As they slid into a booth, Michael felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. It was as if the din of the outside world had quieted down, and for this one evening he could simply be Michael, the man sitting across from the man who had been there for him when the world had failed to recognize his potential. Mr. Wilson, now dressed in his clean button-up shirt and khakis, seemed more at ease. The tension of his daily grind momentarily lifted. His face softened as he scanned the menu, and Michael could see the childlike excitement in his eyes at the prospect of enjoying a meal in such a familiar, comforting setting. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, approached their table, and immediately her gaze fell on Michael. She froze for a moment, her eyes wide in recognition. Michael, ever the humble icon, simply smiled and nodded politely. It was a moment that was both familiar and strange for him. Years of being in the public eye had made him used to the attention, but tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't the famous basketball player. He was a man sitting across from someone who had been a mentor, a quiet force of support during his darkest days. This wasn't about autographs or photos. It was about sharing a quiet moment with someone who had always seen his potential, even when he couldn't see it himself. "2 menus, please," Michael said, his voice warm but unassuming. The waitress nodded, almost in a daze, and hurried off to fetch their menus. Michael turned his attention back to Mr. Wilson, his eyes filled with genuine curiosity. "So, tell me about your family," he asked softly. It was a question Michael had meant to ask earlier, but it had taken a back seat to the rush of memories and emotions that had surfaced during their reunion. "I know you mentioned your wife, Martha. What's she like?" Mr. Wilson's eyes lit up at the mention of his wife, and his smile grew wider. "Martha's the best," he said, his voice thick with affection. "We've been married almost 58 years. She makes me a ham sandwich with the crust cut off every Tuesday. That's her way of showing she still cares, even after all these years." Michael chuckled, appreciating the simple beauty of their love. "That's amazing. What about your kids?" "They're doing well," Mr. Wilson replied. "James and Lynette both out west now, got grandkids and great-grandkids too. Never thought I'd be a grandfather, but it's been the greatest gift of all." The waitress returned, bringing 2 menus and, as expected, a basketball for Michael to sign. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes still wide with awe. "I can't believe it," she said breathlessly, her voice full of wonder. "You're Michael Jordan." Michael gave her a polite smile, signing the ball as he did countless times before. "Just a guy enjoying a meal with an old friend," he said, trying to keep things light and grounded. Mr. Wilson looked at him with a twinkle in his eye, chuckling. "Must be strange, getting recognized all the time." Michael shrugged. "You get used to it." But his mind wasn't on the fans or the autographs. It was on Mr. Wilson, the man who had seen him for who he truly was, even when he was just a skinny kid with big dreams. The meal arrived, 2 cheeseburgers and the famous chocolate milkshakes. As they dug into their food, Michael turned the conversation back to Mr. Wilson. "You've been working at Laney for a long time now. What's kept you going all these years?" Mr. Wilson paused, taking a moment to think. His fingers gently tapped the edge of his milkshake glass, his gaze distant for a moment as he processed the question. "The kids," he said simply. "Watching them grow up. Watching them become something more than they were when they walked through those doors. That's what keeps me coming back." Michael nodded, feeling the weight of his words. He had always known that there was more to the world than basketball. The real value in life was in the relationships we build, the people we uplift along the way. Mr. Wilson had helped countless students, including Michael, find their way. He had been more than just a janitor. He had been a quiet force of encouragement, a man who believed in the potential of others when they couldn't see it themselves. "Did you ever imagine," Michael asked, "that you'd have such an impact on so many people's lives?" Mr. Wilson shrugged, his smile modest. "I didn't do anything special, son. I just showed up and did my job. But when you see kids like you come through and make something of themselves, you realize that maybe you did have a little part in it." As they finished their meal, Michael felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had never realized just how much Mr. Wilson had impacted his life until this moment. The quiet belief he had shown, the hours spent after school helping Michael hone his skills. These were the moments that had shaped him into who he was today. As they sat together, sharing memories and laughter over milkshakes, Michael realized that this dinner wasn't just about catching up. It was about honoring a man who had made a difference without ever expecting recognition. Reflecting on the past. As the last remnants of their meal were cleared away and the last of their chocolate milkshakes sipped, Michael leaned back in his booth, his mind alive with memories. The evening had been more than just a reunion. It had been a deep dive into the past, a place he rarely allowed himself to visit. Sitting across from Mr. Wilson, hearing stories of a life quietly lived in the background, Michael felt the weight of the years, the countless moments that had shaped both of their lives in ways they couldn't have foreseen. There was something incredibly humbling about Mr. Wilson. Here was a man who had dedicated nearly 5 decades to a job that most would dismiss as insignificant. Yet to Michael, it was clear that Mr. Wilson had always been a person of extraordinary value. As a young man, Michael had been consumed with his dreams of basketball greatness. He was focused on his goals, his ambition blinding him to the small, everyday kindnesses that helped build the foundation of his success. It was only in this moment, sitting in this modest diner, that Michael truly grasped the extent to which people like Mr. Wilson had quietly shaped him. "Tell me something," Michael asked, his voice steady but thoughtful. "When you first started working at Laney, did you ever think you'd be doing it for this long?" Mr. Wilson shifted in his seat, his hands folding in front of him as he thought carefully about the question. His eyes glistened slightly, a reflection of the quiet pride he carried for his long service. "No, son," he said after a pause. "When I first started here, I didn't think I'd be here for more than a few years. But you know, life has a way of taking you places you never expected. The kids, they become your family in a way. You watch them grow, learn, and go off to do great things. I guess that's why I stayed. It became more than just cleaning floors. It became about being there for them, just like I was there for you." Michael's chest tightened at the simplicity of Mr. Wilson's words. It wasn't just about the work, it was about the connection to the people, the community, and the quiet moments of influence that ripple outwards. Mr. Wilson had never sought accolades or recognition. He had simply shown up, day after day, doing his job with integrity and care, and in doing so, he had become an integral part of Michael's journey, an unwavering figure who had stood in the background, helping nurture the potential in a boy who would go on to change the world. As Michael listened to Mr. Wilson speak, he was reminded of the day he had been cut from the varsity team. He had been devastated, angry, and embarrassed, sitting alone in the gym, shooting free throws in the dark, convinced that he would never make it. It was on that day that Mr. Wilson had come to him, offering words of encouragement that no one else had. "You remember that day?" Michael asked, his voice soft, the memory surfacing like a forgotten song. Mr. Wilson smiled, his eyes softening. "Of course I do. You were shooting in the dark, wouldn't even turn on the lights. I remember thinking, this kid's got something. I knew you'd make it, even if you didn't know it yet." Michael's mind flashed back to that moment, the isolation, the determination, the raw emotion of it all. And there in that memory was Mr. Wilson, offering him the keys to the gym, telling him that sometimes the best players are the ones who have to fight for their spot. "You handed me the keys to the gym," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "You told me to practice as long as I wanted, as long as I locked up when I was done." Mr. Wilson chuckled softly. "I had to kick you out so I could go home to dinner. You were always the last one to leave." "I remember that," Michael said, his voice full of gratitude. "You believed in me when no one else did. You made me feel like I was worth something, even when I didn't make the team." "Son," Mr. Wilson said quietly, "you were always worth something. I saw that in you. And I wasn't the only one. You just needed a little time to see it yourself." For a moment, the weight of Mr. Wilson's words hung in the air between them. It was one of those rare moments when Michael felt like everything had come full circle. He had spent his life proving himself to the world, fighting for recognition, but in that moment it was clear that true worth didn't come from accolades or public acclaim. True worth came from the quiet acts of kindness, the moments when someone believed in you when you couldn't believe in yourself. Mr. Wilson had given Michael something priceless. Not just the belief that he could be better, but the understanding that sometimes the most important people in our lives are the ones who work quietly behind the scenes, without ever asking for anything in return. "You know, I never realized how much you meant to me back then," Michael said, his voice low. "But I see it now. You were more than a janitor. You were a mentor, a guide, someone who helped shape the person I became, and I can never thank you enough for that." Mr. Wilson smiled, the wrinkles on his face deepening, his eyes glimmering with pride. "You don't need to thank me, son. You made it on your own. I just gave you a little nudge when you needed it." As they sat in the dim light of the diner, the conversation began to wind down, but the weight of their exchange lingered. Michael knew that this evening was one he would never forget, not because of the fame or the accolades, but because of the quiet, unassuming man sitting across from him who had shaped his life with nothing more than simple kindness, unwavering support, and belief. Michael Jordan's success had been built on more than just his talent. It had been built on the foundation laid by people like Mr. Wilson, unsung heroes who changed lives in ways no one could ever fully measure. The unexpected decision. As the evening began to draw to a close, Michael felt a profound shift within him. The streets of Wilmington, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, seemed to slow down as he sat quietly in the car beside Mr. Wilson. It had been an evening of memories, of quiet revelations, and of rediscovering the deep, enduring impact of a man who had unknowingly played a crucial role in shaping the trajectory of his life. Michael felt something stir inside him. A sense of responsibility, a need to take action, to do something for Mr. Wilson that went beyond words, beyond gratitude. This was no longer just a dinner. It had become a turning point, not only in their lives, but in Michael's understanding of his purpose and the power of kindness. Michael had been to the top of the mountain. He had seen the lights, the applause, the recognition. He had won championships, secured endorsement deals, and had his name etched in the annals of sports history. Yet none of those triumphs seemed as significant as the quiet, understated man sitting next to him, Mr. Wilson, the janitor. The realization hit him harder than any slam dunk or buzzer beater. Success wasn't about what you could accumulate or the titles you could claim. It was about the impact you left on others, the difference you made in people's lives. And for Mr. Wilson, That impact had been immeasurable. As Michael thought back to the early days of his career, to the many hours he spent working in that gym, practicing long after everyone else had gone home, he couldn't help but think of the sacrifices Mr. Wilson had made, sacrifices that no one had ever acknowledged. The janitor had given his time freely, quietly, without expecting anything in return. He had allowed Michael the space to grow, to fail, to rise again. He had believed in Michael when the world had written him off, and now Michael was faced with a decision. How could he repay that unspoken debt? How could he honor the man who had always believed in him, even when no one else did? The thought gnawed at him, and by the time they reached Mr. Wilson's modest home on the outskirts of Wilmington, Michael knew what he had to do. The house was small, its paint chipped, and the yard showed signs of neglect, but even in its worn-down state, it felt like a home, warm, inviting, a reflection of the love and care that had been poured into it over the years. As Mr. Wilson slowly made his way up the cracked pathway, Michael couldn't help but notice the frailty of the man who had been so strong in his youth. Mr. Wilson was a survivor, but age and the weight of time had left their mark. When Mr. Wilson invited Michael inside, the modest living room greeted him with its mix of old furniture and framed family photos. It was a humble home, but it was filled with love. A love that had been steadfast for nearly 6 decades. Michael smiled at the sight of the scrapbook, the one filled with articles and clippings of his high school and professional career, a testament to the pride Mr. Wilson had taken in watching him grow. It was clear that, though Mr. Wilson had never sought anything in return, he had always taken immense pride in Michael's success. The quiet janitor had always seen the potential in the young man he had helped, and now it was Michael's turn to see the potential in him. Michael stood in the small living room, his thoughts swirling. He had often spoken of giving back, of helping others, but in that moment the need to do something concrete, something meaningful, became overwhelming. It wasn't enough to offer words of thanks or a fleeting gesture of kindness. Michael knew that the time had come to show Mr. Wilson just how much he meant to him, not just as a mentor, but as a person who had been a silent force in his life, a steady hand guiding him when the world seemed unsure. Without a second thought, Michael made a decision that would stun everyone, Mr. Wilson included. He turned to the elderly man, his voice steady and determined. "Mr. Wilson, I've been thinking," Michael began, his eyes locking with the janitor's. "You've spent so many years giving your time, your energy, your life to others. It's time someone took care of you." Mr. Wilson looked at Michael, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What do you mean, son?" Michael paused, the weight of his decision settling in. "I want to help. I want to make sure you and your wife have everything you need. You've done so much for me, for this community. It's time to give back, to make sure you're taken care of." The words hung in the air, and for a long moment Mr. Wilson said nothing. His eyes watered slightly, and his weathered hands trembled as he tried to process what Michael was saying. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've made my peace with things. I don't need much." But Michael shook his head, stepping closer. "I know you've never asked for anything, but that's not how this works. You've earned this. You've earned more than I could ever give you in a lifetime, but I'm going to start somewhere. You've given so much, and now it's my turn to take care of you." Mr. Wilson's eyes filled with gratitude, his expression softening as he realized the depth of Michael's offer. It wasn't just about money or material things. It was about a life being transformed. It was about a gesture of profound gratitude and love for the man who had given so much without ever expecting anything in return. As they stood together in the modest living room of the home that had sheltered Mr. Wilson and his wife for so many years, Michael knew that his decision was the right one. In that moment, he realized that the greatest gift he could give Mr. Wilson wasn't just a check or a house. It was the recognition of a life well lived, the acknowledgement of a man who had quietly shaped the course of history in ways that could never be measured by awards or trophies. The decision had been made, and Michael knew that this was just the beginning of something much larger, a commitment to ensuring that Mr. Wilson would never again feel forgotten, never again feel like the work he had done was in vain. It was time for Michael Jordan to give back in the most meaningful way possible, and he was ready to take the first step. As Michael walked away from Mr. Wilson's home, he realized this wasn't just about a one-time gesture. It was the beginning of something greater. It wasn't about fame or titles, but about giving back, honoring the unsung heroes who shape our lives. Now it's your turn. Think about those who've helped you along the way. Who believed in you when no one else did? I challenge you to reach out and show your gratitude. A small act of kindness can make a world of difference. Join this movement, subscribe to our channel, and share your story in the comments. Let's build a community that celebrates giving back, kindness, and gratitude. Your story matters, and together we can inspire others to do the same. Hit the subscribe button and leave a comment. Let's create a ripple of generosity and kindness that will last.